Basically, everybody, welcome to this morning's webinar on climate-related and environmental risk. What now? My name is Sandie O'Leary. I'm head of the subscription-based risk advisory service at calQrisk, and I'll be making this presentation this morning. The presentation element should take about 35 minutes. There'll be about another 10 minutes at the end to answer any questions that you may have in the course of the presentation or afterwards. Depending on how long or what topics they may cover, it might be easier to address the short questions there and then. Otherwise, if there's a bit more involved, I will follow up with them after the presentation, if that's okay. I know your time is precious, so we'll try and keep to the 45 minutes maximum. Basically, today we're focusing on the climate-related and environmental risk and what now, prompted, I suppose, by the central bank's letter at the end of November. I guess why me is more around the fact that I have obviously been working with credit unions for the last 15 years in both community and industrial credit unions over the years. I've developed and delivered risk and compliance modules to credit union professionals across the country and through various institutions. And I've enjoyed engaging with a lot of the people that are on this morning's session, and hopefully will continue to do so. It's a service which obviously tries to bring the best of the knowledge that we have gleaned together collectively over the years to each other, so that nobody is standing in an isolated position trying to figure out where to go. So on this particular topic, what do we do now? The idea behind it really was that this has been coming for a while. Central Bank, as we know, circulated a survey some time ago. A lot of credit unions would have looked at the survey, established where they were at that point in time, and thought, right, okay, what do we do next? Some made a good start. Others kind of took it as, okay, this is where we are now. Let's wait to see what guidance comes from Central Bank, and then we'll decide what to do next. So in the interests of, I suppose, focusing on the key issues for people attending today, what I will try to do is focus on practical risk management steps that credit unions can and should be taking now if they're starting out. But it's also maybe a good time to do a status check for those who are much further along the journey, and hopefully provide reassurance that all the bases are covered. So as I mention items and areas as we go through this session, hopefully you'll be in a position to take off some or all of them if you're much further along that journey. We also, within the team here in calQrisk, have a lot of other additional expert knowledge in this area. So if there are more detailed queries, we can always follow up on that later on, if that's okay. So a quotation which always struck me and I thought was particularly relevant, but also, quite impactful, was a quotation from Barack Obama, who's former US president, that we are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change, and we're the last generation who can do something about it. It's frightening, but at the same time, it's quite positive. It means, whatever's happened, we can do something about it. We may not be able to fix it entirely, but we can do something about it, and we are all part of that effort. So I think what we'll find is that credit unions have been making efforts for some time. They've been thinking about this for some time, and I guess part of the concern has always been, how do we even start? Credit unions, some, as I said, for some time might have been making small efforts, developing into more material changes. Some are a long way there, possibly even nearly there. But then a lot of others have a lot of anxiety about even starting. They're afraid of opening a can of worms and afraid of what is that going to mean for us? How much is it going to cost us? Where we're going to have to go? So for those of you who have not yet got to grips with it, I hope this short webinar will give you an opportunity to see how far you have come, if you have begun, but also where you can make a material starting point and provide that reassurance that I mentioned earlier, that if there are gaps, they can be addressed going forward. It's about knowing what those gaps are in the first place and then dealing with it. So the key thing today is to start that journey if you haven't, or to move further along that journey if you're already underway. So it's just to lay the ground rules. You'll be delighted there are not many definitions in today's presentation. there's just two things I think that are really important to get established right from the beginning in terms of any discussion on climate change and environmental risk. And that is the fact that there are two elements to it. There's the physical risk and there's the transition risk. The physical risk is important. And we think about that in terms of the changing climate, the financial impact that's likely to accrue as the climate changes, with more extreme weather events, gradual changes in the climate, as well as in environmental degradation, such as to the air, water, and land pollution, water stress, biodiversity loss, and deforestation. So a lot of time we tend to think about those physical manifestations of what climate change is and how we can see it happening in and around us. But the challenge with that is it's quite hard to see how it's changing because it takes such a long period of time. For us, transition risk is really important. And this is one that really challenges the credit unions themselves. And it's important to get this clear in our minds. What do we mean by transition risk? And it's basically the loss to an institution that can result directly or indirectly from the process of adjustment towards that low carbon economy that we are looking to move towards in order to be more sustainable in the long run. That can be triggered by any number of things, from a very sudden adoption of policies at government and at national level or at international level. It could be technological progress or lack of in terms of how to address an environmental issue that faces us, or it could simply be changes to sentiment in our own markets, whatever industries we're in, and in particular in the credit union movement, how are members feeling at a particular point in time about environmental and climate-related risk. Why do we need to worry about those? Well, really, I guess, for me, the most important distinction between the two is the timelines that are associated with them. The more severe, let's say, chronic physical risks are likely to materialize over a much longer period. And that in itself can lead to a sense of complacency. Oh, we'll deal with that tomorrow, or I'll think about that next year, or when we have budget for that, we'll maybe slot something in on that. But the transition risk side to the business is far more likely to materialize sooner rather than later. The international emissions targets that are already being communicated are out there. There are government taxes on high carbon industries. They're building in tax incentives to engage in more carbon neutral activities. And there are subsidies for things like low carbon industries. For example, like large public bodies already have decarbonisation targets to meet. They have their own emissions targets, that their own low carbon construction methods, et cetera, that need to be built into their day-to-day operations. So the transition risk piece is important because it brings that timeline much closer to us. It's something we can get our heads around. It's something that we can see the more immediate effects materializing. And hopefully that, I suppose, counterbalances that potential for a sense of complacency as regards when or why we should be acting. Oops. So where to begin? So to understand exactly what climate and environmental risk means for your credit union, you must establish a baseline. You have to be able to figure out where we start and where we're moving to, ideally. But you don't have to have it as a specific in terms of all of the measurements for the future, but it's about establishing today, where are our risks? What level are we at today? And as we try to improve, how do we prove to ourselves, how do we demonstrate to ourselves and any other stakeholders that we are actually making progress? So it's important that you do a risk assessment for the credit union. In terms of a multi-site operation, so if you are a credit union which has multiple branches, you need to conduct that assessment for each site, because they will each have and likely will have different implications in terms of a risk in this area. It will depend on the age of the building, the location of the building, and so on and so forth. So it is important to try and make sure that you have a good picture of where the risks are for each individual site. Now, you can collate that information and summarize it to your board in an overall risk assessment, but from a detail level, it is important that you know exactly what the picture is for each individual site. The key thing to put across today, if you haven't already started, is please don't put it off. Start that risk assessment, but try not to be overwhelmed. Begin with what you have. You will be surprised how much information you actually have in a credit union if you haven't already started looking. But the point being, if you have a list of things that you want to look at over time, you'll find that there's certain information there now. There's certain information you might begin to collect now, so that for the next review or update, you'll have more information, or you might have something to base your future projections on. Basically, it's kind of one of those things that the more you put it off, it's not going to get any better in terms of the level of detail that you're going to be able to get into. If you don't begin now, you'll be challenged even, just as much the next time you come to look at it. Just because you have a list of gaps, that does not mean that's such a bad thing. In risk terms, we call it our risk mitigation plan. Other terms would be gap analysis that then leads into a risk mitigation plan. Risk advisory service subscribers to the service have already received a very detailed step-by-step guide on how to conduct that risk assessment under each of the categories and what sort of things you might look to include, or how you might start to gather that information. But whatever you have, do try to begin with the information that you have available now and build from there with each subsequent review or update. It is not going to be a one and done exercise. This is something that is going to need review and change on a constant basis. In terms then of areas to focus on, we are very clear that there are some very important, a number of very important themes that work through it. Sorry, my mouse is getting carried away with me. First thing is to communicate how the CRE risk affects your credit union. I'm going to look at each of these in detail as we go through, but I just want to give you the topics first. So communication, I can't stress that enough. Establishing clear risk ownership in relation to the climate-related and environmental risk, and promoting a positive climate action culture through strong governance. I think it is one of those things that I'm sure boards of directors get exhausted by saying it all comes down to governance. But it is one of these areas where strong leadership and setting the tone is critical. If the message isn't coming from the right direction in the right terms, then it is very hard to see it materialize in a positive way. You have to make it integral to strategic planning. There's no point in kind of doing your strategic planning and then thinking, all right, let's shoehorn in a little bit. We'll have a look at how that can be done in later slides. It needs to be embedded into your risk management framework. Again, not as a necessarily, like we will have individual risks in this area, but it needs to be considered in terms of a lot of the other existing risks. It needs to become part of how the risk management officer thinks or the risk management function operates. And this has always been one of the challenging ones for me, even in my previous roles as risk management officer, is developing scenario analyses. And in my role now, I actually have time to do this, which is great. It's nice to actually be able to take that, I suppose, blue sky approach sometimes, but in your individual credit unions, you need to make sure that your scenario analysis is very specific to your credit union. Otherwise, the exercise itself is of little value. And we'll look at how we're going to do that in a while as well. One thing just to, and I will discuss this again later on, but just to make sure that if your credit union has chosen to make voluntary disclosures in this area, and for credit unions it would be voluntary at the moment, it's not mandatory, make sure that you avoid greenwashing, and we'll have a look at what that means a little later. So to start with, what now for governance? And this is kind of the keys I would like to try and communicate today. A few points on each of those key areas is what you could do on a practical level, or begin, even if you're not going to be able to complete it, you can begin to move towards, pretty much immediately. The first thing, there are two things I'm going to look at from a governance perspective, and the first thing is the board's risk appetite statement. As we said earlier, it's very much about setting the tone from the top. It's about adding in some qualitative and quantitative elements that you can measure and monitor how you're doing with. And it is really important that this needs to be very transparent for the organization. Your credit union needs to be able to point to the document and say, we as a credit union have decided what our appetite is in relation to this particular risk. Ways you can do that is to improve CRE risk awareness amongst credit union officers and members. And that might mean raising it at a training session. It might mean, addressing it as the topic in a management team meeting, at a staff meeting, at a board meeting. I will not do what everybody else, what you often see, it needs to be on the board's agenda. God help the poor board. Their agenda would be about 10 pages long if we kept adding in all the things that are meant to be on the board's agenda. It will be on the board's broader agenda, but it doesn't have to be on its monthly agenda. So just make sure that it is coming up, that it's coming up regularly, that it is more built into the everyday decisions than a standalone agenda item. Is the credit union's building energy rating? If you know that, and that's the term we use in the Republic, in the North, it's referred to as the Energy Performance Certificate. So if you know what that it is for your building at this point in time, then you have a baseline. You can then, if you have plans to do some work on the building and improve your ratings, then you'll be able to measure that progress in years to come. But if you don't know what it is now and you start to do, nice positive efforts and making changes, there will be, you could open yourselves up to accusations of greenwashing because you actually have no evidence to show that you've made progress from one point in time to another. If you could establish the credit union's current carbon footprint, again, it's a great way to establish your baseline. You probably need help with that. There are companies and services that will help you establish your carbon footprint. There are online tools that will help you to establish that. And again, it gives you a good picture of a point in time where you are, and then you'll be able to see how you're making progress. Your investment portfolio is another nice area to be able to look at to see how you're doing. It is something that is, I think, become more common now, that as investments come up for renewals, we're looking at the counterparties' ESG credentials, their environmental, social, and governance credentials. I'm not saying it has to be a factor in the final decision in relation to the investment decision itself, but it could be an influencing factor if you've got two comparable investments, decent returns, they're giving you what you want from the investment. And if you have the choice between one with really strong ESG credentials, you'd hope you wouldn't be going for someone with poor credentials, but either way, you might have limited information, for example. So again, the idea being that if you can start to keep an eye on that and track that, you'll be able to see how you're doing progress-wise over the years. This is not going to be an overnight fix, all of this in terms of monitoring and being able to demonstrate good governance in terms of climate-related and environmental risk. The other area for governance is to begin to promote that positive climate environmental risk culture. And I think communication is vital in this. It's really important that it's communicated as a priority for your credit union. Allocating appropriate resource is the first and strongest starting point in relation to this. And to do that, it's good to identify a good champion. And I do say a good champion, because you really need to make sure that the champion that you appoint has an actual interest in this area, or is at least open-minded about it. Otherwise, if anything, it could actually be counterproductive. So you want to try and engage somebody who has a passion or an interest in this particular area, who's going to be willing and able to drive it forward, set an example, encourage people without beating them around the head over it, ideally. And then that helps to communicate that positive culture that we're trying to establish. You can, as an organization, as a board, try and provide access to your teams to expert advice. And as I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of free government resources available. There are tools in both ROI and NI to help credit unions in this particular area. If you need them, give me a shout afterwards. We can communicate the links to some of these that are really, really useful. There's also the element of training and information. And, you know, even sessions like this, it will be recorded. We can share that and just I suppose, keep it at the forefront of our minds. We all know that there's a lot of things going on a day-to-day basis for credit unions, no matter which role you perform. It's a bit of a case of he who shouts loudest kind of comes to the forefront of your brain. It's hard to keep climate, environmental risk issues at the forefront of your brain, as we mentioned earlier, because an awful lot of it is slow moving. Even the guidance that's available is slow moving. So if we can maybe periodically provide those training and information opportunities, whether it's something that comes through, you can share a link or a report, whether it's a webinar, something like that, just to keep it fresh, to keep it, on people's radars. That's one of the key ways to promote that culture. So in terms then of strategic planning, that too begins today. We know that strategic planning is a long and it can be challenging process, in that people begin elements of strategic planning and they don't actually see the results for quite a number of years in many cases. But it doesn't mean we don't start. When it comes to CRE risk, it's really important the credit union has a clear understanding of how the climate risks will impact on their own strategic plan. And these will be both positive and negative. There are things, I'm going to talk about them next. There are opportunities in there which are quite positive from the credit union strategic planning perspective. From a risk management of climate and environmental risk, we tend to think of the more negative aspects of it and how do we mitigate them and manage them. But each particular aspect of the credit union's strategic plan should be reviewed. We should look at it within the context of the CRE risks and see how they're likely to impact on your specific credit union. And they will vary from credit union to credit union. Each one will have a different potential impact, if any. The strategic plan itself might need to be adjusted based on your findings. So, for example, if the goal is to grow your loan book, what loan product opportunities does CRE risk provide? We'll have a look at that in a later slide. If your goal is to minimize loan arrears, for example, are there any large exposures that would be materially impacted by CRE-related taxes or subsidies? So it could be on the positive or the negative side. In terms of your future business model, for example, are there things that you can start to think about and picture for your vision of the future? Things like maybe alterations to the building, could even be a completely new building. So your location may have to change for one reason or another, particularly if you're currently already prone to climate-related issues. What about the impact of higher or lower utility costs? These can be built into your future vision of your business model. Your service delivery channels. Are there changes that you're going to be building in? So what is your future vision going to look like for your business? And these need to be built in. One thing I would say is, if you are going to be changing your strategic plan or your business, your vision for the future, make sure you document that it's as a result of consideration of CRE risks. It's documenting that rationale to show that this is the reason why you're making these changes, as opposed to just apparently randomly deciding to make these changes. Document it, and that helps to build up that body of evidence, that clear demonstration to any stakeholders that might want to see it, that CRE and risk, this area of risk, is being built into the strategic planning process from the ground up. So in terms of the positives then, there are strategic opportunities from this particular area. There are quite a few areas that are actually, hopefully going to benefit credit unions in the long run. If you, for example, have your running costs, you've established them, maybe through your baseline activities, you've determined where your exposures, your key challenges are. If you are going to make changes, there could be improvements to your operational running costs in the long run. They could become more sustainable. So that's an opportunity for you to think about, how do you make your operations more sustainable in terms of running costs? There are new business loan products opportunities. If you aim at sectors who are going through their own transition risks, so there are various sectors of industry and of business, where they're trying to make these same types of efforts to become more sustainable in their own activities. And they need funding, they need support to make those changes and to make that move towards a more sustainable future. There are the equivalent business loans to support climate and environmental risk innovation. One of the things that central bank and other regulators and environmental agencies internationally speak about, in particular in terms of this transition period and transition risk, is that there is constant innovation across the world in terms of how to address the climate-related issues. And if there is a business within your credit union's common bond that is contributing to that activity, then consider business loans to support that type of activity. But again, make sure you flag it and you know what they are. Your green loan products. We've been talking about green loan products and credit unions for years and years. And I guess, you know, various credit unions have made efforts along those lines. I think it has become more expected now. And I think that the importance of being clear and transparent with our members as to, you know, so they can feel better about the types of investment that they are making with their funds and with the funds that they've borrowed from credit unions. So if we can, as credit unions, support that initiative through the provision of green loans for whether it be electric cars, green home improvements, etc., all of those areas, then that's only a good thing. I think one of the key things to remember for credit unions is that you are already leaders in your community in so many different areas. It's, you know, the reputation of credit unions is incomparable to any other financial service, not to mention even other industries. So it's really important that if we want to continue to be an example, to be a leader in the community, then this journey towards a more sustainable society is one we can also shine in. I noticed I still use the words we. I still think of myself as a credit union person, even though I'm not obviously employed in the credit union anymore. But I see myself as being part of the credit union team still. And it is one of those terms I keep using, we. So as I say, I always feel I'm still one of the credit union officers, whether it's actually literal or figurative. In terms of the feasibility of any of these opportunities, I guess it's important to remember that it will depend very much on the credit union's own business profile and exposures. If you're already on this path and you've done a lot of these things already, then my message would be analyze how you're doing, see how you're performing, have a look at each of these categories, measure them. If you've been doing it but not measuring it, if you've not had a baseline to compare to, then start to build that in. And that's a key part of this whole journey, is being able to show and be able to internally and externally that we're actually making progress. And remember, if it's important to credit union members, and it would appear that it is, then it should be important for the credit union itself. So, you know, it's all tied in together. In terms of the risk management framework itself, then, if we look at the framework, that's obviously built up with risk identification, risk measurement, risk mitigation plans, and your task assignment, monitoring and reporting. All of these things are really important. You guys, as anybody that's here, that's attending today, who's a risk management officer in the risk management function, knows all about these. There was a few key areas that you need to be looking at as risks. If you have no's when you do your analysis and you ask yourself your questions and you have no's, then they become your risk mitigation plan. Scenario analysis is evolving. It's really important that it has to be plausible for your credit union, particularly depending on your geographical location, your financial and physical location. The Risk Advisory Service subscribers' risk assessment that I already circulated to them includes an outline approach to a scenario testing, and it gives, you know, a good, hopefully, starting point for people beginning that particular journey. But remember that it has to be plausible. So, for example, a flood-based scenario is not going to be particularly useful for a credit union which is located hundreds of feet above sea level and nowhere near a river or a lake or another natural water source that's likely to flood. So if you're doing your scenario analysis, probably better to look at storm disruption to electricity supply or something similar that would be more credible and more useful to you in the short and long term. In terms of disclosures, credit unions are not currently obliged to make environmental disclosures to members, but if they choose to do so, then it's important to avoid greenwashing, which is the practice basically of making false or misleading statements. And, you know, that's tempting, you know, because there's lots of things that are kind of, you know, oh, we know we're doing the right thing, but could we show it? Could we demonstrate it? So it's very important to be able to communicate from a position of strength. And your measuring and your efforts that you're taking will become your basis for those type of statements if you need to in the future. You know, it isn't always, we don't always do things because it's mandatory. Sometimes it's a good thing to do. And if you are making disclosures, just make sure, as I said, that you start building up your body of evidence so that you can support any future statements that you might wish to make. So I suppose the big question is, if not now, then when? Remember, if you don't start now, you won't be able to report on progress next year either. So you have to make a start at some point. If you've already implemented many of the recommendations or comments or suggestions that I've made, can you see any trends that are emerging? Are some areas stronger than others? Is there more that we could be doing in particular areas? And that's where you'll move yourselves forward also. But coming back to the point, what can we do today? Now, we all know credit unions cannot be the entire solution to climate-related environmental risk. But as a financial service provider with the most credibility in the market, you as credit unions can lead by example and facilitate a ground upwards approach to change. It's really this simple. It is one energy saving effort at a time, one loan supporting CRE effort at a time, one CRE friendly investment at a time, one community support effort at a time. It's not rocket science. One at a time takes us a step closer every step that we take. And make a start on the rest. All those other good things we just spoke about and lots of others you've probably already thought about yourselves. Make a start on the rest and don't forget to record your efforts. It's recording the efforts becomes really important. If you are a Risk Advisory Service subscriber, the CRE risk assessment was circulated by email on the 15th of December and it's available on the subscriber's website. If you'd like any other specific credit union, maybe specific information or help on that area, let me know. If you're not subscribing to the Risk Advisory Service, but you'd like information on any features of the service, costs, etc., please do feel free to email me at sandie.o'leary@calqrisk.com or call me on my mobile 086 176 2363. These slides will be circulated afterwards, so all of this information will be available to you and we will be put up on the website afterwards. So, any questions? Now, I haven't, literally with all my talking, I haven't really dipped in yet. Yep, no, I can't see any questions. Is there any questions anybody would like to ask? How are we doing for time? I think we're doing spot on in terms of time. We have, yeah, I'm impressed with myself in the sense of me and my talking, which can get a bit carried away. We haven't applied for CPD as it's actually such a short session. I can have a look and I can always apply for it now and I can communicate that back to you. We can certainly look into it and if we do get something, I'll certainly circulate it. Question from Siobhan, could you set how we factor in CRE in credit risk assessment? Could you set how we factor in CRE in credit risk assessment? I guess there's lots of different ways that you can look at your loan book. And one of the things I've kind of been recommending based on, I suppose, a lot of the research that's out there, even in relation to climate generally and its effects, is there's a standard categorization for industries, the NACE categorization. And I think one of the first things to do in terms of the loan book is to see what your credit union's own exposure is by category. You may have collected information historically and kind of identified which industries or maybe just employers that your members are in. So I wouldn't worry immediately too much about how individual loans are exposed, because I think a lot of that information could well be out of date. But you can get a broad picture of how your credit union, maybe common bond, is exposed to certain types of industries, because within that NACE categorization, there are some areas which are obviously more CRE impacted than others, and you might be able to establish what percentage of your loan book is exposed to those particular areas. If you want to take it a step further, you could possibly do a survey of your borrowers. Again, I would recommend using the same categorization so that you can compare that information going forward. And as new results or as new research becomes available, we're all talking about the same categories and you can compare a bit more readily. If you don't want to go down the survey route to have, let's say, the most accurate information, you can just maybe start to build up over time your picture of your credit union's exposure. If you think about how quickly loans tend to change, we talk a lot about the churn on the loan book in credit unions. So a lot of loans do change in a relatively short period of time, between 12 months and 5 years. So over a time period, you'd be surprised at how much you can maybe refresh the information around your database. So if you haven't got that type of categorization yet, you could build it up and it could be one of your future targets. So that's one of the things. In terms of, I suppose, provisioning is an area I've been thinking about a bit in this regard. I think if you can analyze your loan book and see whether you already have exposure. So, for example, you might see that if there was a local weather event, flooding, God forbid, or anything like that, was there a spike in demand for loans at the time? Do we know which loans? And I'm not saying you'll always know, a loan for home improvements might be home improvements due to flood damage, but you might not know that at the time. But if you can even just use that sort of data, if there was a local event, that you could see what the spike was in the immediate aftermath, you might be able to build up a provisioning profile around a certain bucket of loans in your loan book. And so you might be able to build that element into your credit risk assessment. So there are a few things you can think of in that area. Hopefully that's answered your question for now, Siobhan, but I'm happy to engage on that directly, afterwards as well, and just see what else, what other areas we could look at. Any other questions? So, all quiet on that front. I've put you all to sleep, or hopefully I've satisfied the questions. As I say, I know it's quite high level, but in a 45-minute session, there's a limited amount of detail. I guess the whole point being that if you want to dive into this, now's the time to start. If I can be of any assistance, please let me know. In terms of this particular area, it is one of those things that I think once you start, it almost develops a life of its own. So it is good to kind of go to begin that journey. See your comment. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're good. So let's say I'd allocated 45 minutes. I'm happy to kind of stay for another few minutes and see if there are any further questions. I think hopefully gave you, I suppose, a refresher, if nothing else. Let's say I am conscious that there are probably people on this group that are well down the road to sustainable future in terms of your credit union operations and business and your members' interests. But hopefully it will serve as a refresher. And for those who have been a bit maybe nervous about beginning, there are lots of places you can begin. You don't have to have all the answers immediately. You don't have to have even all the questions immediately. So, but we will collectively try and move forward. And I do feel, one of the most important things we tend to think of is that let's not delay. As they say in Ireland, too small, la nihibra. A good start is half the work. So if you make that start, you'll start to sleep a little bit better, and the task might not seem quite as onerous as it may have in the beginning. Just to keep an eye, just to see, is there anything else on the questions? Yeah, as Patricia mentioned there, said, yeah, chances are all the questions will arise once you start doing the work. So as I say, I'm here to help. Please do come back to me if there's anything that occurs to you afterwards, and if there's anything we can be of assistance to you on. So I've probably taken up enough of your time today. If there aren't any more questions, I think the most important thing is to let you get back to the day job. And thank you for listening. And I appreciate your time today, and I hope it was of some assistance and benefit. And you know where I am. Thanks, everyone.